What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Today we're going to be talking about planes, axes, and joint actions. Let's get it popping. So this is the anatomical position. Standing straight up and down, palms faced forward with the arms at your sides. And the reason we have the anatomical position, because in various studies done throughout the world, we want a consistency in understanding the body and where different parts are in the body. So the anatomical position is typically what we reference when looking at a bunch of these studies, and so people can have some consistency, whether it's research scientists, physical education teachers, coaches, things along those lines. Now, in this anatomical position, we have three different planes of motion, and basically movements occur in one of these planes predominantly, maybe in multiple planes there, depending on what the movement is. Okay, we'll talk about these planes in a little more detail in the next few slides. So first up is the sagittal plane. Sagittal, letter S. Okay, and the sagittal plane divides the body into left and right sides. So sides starts with the letter S. So sagittal plane divides the body into the left and the right sides. And this plane here, this movement, a few examples of movements that occur in the sagittal plane would be anything directly forward and backwards there. Something like walking, something like running, okay? Something like bicycling, okay? Something like if I was to be a straight ahead kicker, okay? So stepping back directly behind the ball and just running straight forward and kicking it, that would be considered a movement in the sagittal plane. Another example would be shooting a basketball. The hand or the wrist motion in shooting a basketball is an example of movement in the sagittal plane. The frontal plane divides the body into a front side and a back side. The front side, otherwise known as anterior, okay? The way I like to remember this is an anteater, okay, is known for its big long snout, okay, and long tongue to lick up ants there. So anterior is front, just like the front of an anteater, okay, is its funny looking head there. And then the rear, the posterior side, I think posterior, back, behind, okay. So frontal plane divides the body into a front and back side. Now movements that occur in the frontal plane are things that go left and right there. A few examples. Number one would be a jumping jack. This would be an example of a movement in the frontal plane. Another example would be a cartwheel. Cartwheels occur in the frontal plane. Okay. If I'm a goalie here and I raise my arm above my head here sideways to try to block a shot there, okay, that would be an example of a movement in the frontal plane. If I dip my head side to side, that would be an example of a movement in the frontal plane. Then we've got the transverse plane. Okay? Transverse plane divides the body into a top part and a bottom part. Top part is considered to be cranial. Cranial referring to the brain or cranium there. That's how I like to remember it here. The bottom part is caudal. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to refer to the head of a person there, okay? But in general here, we typically think about from the anatomical position wise, we've got a cranial side or the head part and the bottom or the caudal part. Okay? And I like to think about the transverse plane in terms of transportation. So you got Thomas the Tank Engine here. He's a train. He's a mode of transportation. And just like trains kind of move, okay, horizontally, they don't really move vertically. The same thing happens with our transverse plane. Now, movements in the transverse plane, I want you to remember this. Think of any twisting or rotational movement there, okay, as a movement in the transverse plane. Okay, so if I twist side to side, like someone trying to crack their back there, that would be considered a transverse plane movement. If I'm doing bicycle crunches or Russian twists there, that would be considered a transverse plane movement there. Okay. If I am throwing a baseball, okay, so I turn my torso and I twist and throw it there, that would be considered a movement in the transverse plane. Now with each of these planes, we've got one axis of motion that travels through that particular plane. I'll discuss these in the next few slides. So the transverse axis, okay, it's the axis of rotation there, okay. It creates movement there in this sagittal plane, okay. So any sagittal plane movement, okay, has movements that rotate around the transverse axis. So transverse axis there, it's that axis going left and right, okay. It basically goes directly through the sagittal plane there. So remember, sagittal plane movements are examples such as shooting a free throw, running, bicycling, okay. All those have movements that occur in the sagittal plane, okay. And those sagittal plane movements have movements that occur in that transverse axis. Antero-posterior axis, okay, it's this front axis here. It divides the frontal plane, okay, allows movements that occur in that frontal plane. So for example there, frontal plane movements are a jumping jack, if I'm tilting my head side to side, if I'm raising my arms out to the side above my head, okay, to try to block a soccer ball, that would be examples of movements in that anterior plane there, okay, in that frontal plane, and those movements occur there in the antero-posterior axis of rotation. And then finally, we have the longitudinal axis. Longitudinal axis is the axis that goes through the longest part of the body there, okay, and specifically from that anatomical position here, it travels from your head through your feet, okay. And so any movement that occurs in the transverse plane, okay, means that those movements rotate along that longitudinal axis. So again, transverse plane movements, examples would be a bicycle crunch, any kind of twisting side to side, okay. If I'm rotating my wrist there, okay, all those would be examples of longitudinal axes of rotation. So here are some examples, some specific anatomical names of movements that occur in the sagittal plane, okay. So notice here, bringing the elbow up, okay, that would be considered a flexion movement. Bringing the elbow down would be extension, okay. Shoulder coming up, flexion, shoulder coming down, extension. Right here on the left side, we've got wrist flexion and wrist extension. Similar to the legs here, okay. So leg coming up, kicking upward, that would be hip flexion, okay. Bringing the leg down would be hip extension, and hip hyperextension would go behind the body. And then we've got knee flexion, foot coming up, and the extension going down there. So essentially here, what you're looking at is all these in this slide and in this slide are examples of movements that occur in that sagittal plane. So flexion and extension movements occur in the sagittal plane there, okay, meaning that they move about the transverse axis of rotation. One other thing to note here, okay, these flexion and extension movements, okay, when they refer to the arms and the legs here, okay, from the anatomical position, again, referring to the anatomical position to start, flexion movements always go up, extension movements always go down from that anatomical position. So you notice here on the left, we got wrist flexion. Wrist flexion, the wrist is moving up. Extension, wrist will be moving down. Elbow flexion, forearm coming up, elbow extension, forearm coming down. Shoulder flexion, arm coming up, shoulder extension, arm coming down. Likewise with the legs. Hip flexion, leg comes up, hip extension, leg comes down. Knee flexion, knee comes up, knee extension, knee comes down. Now this is opposite, okay? So I talked about that flexion coming up, extension going down when we're referring to the appendicular skeleton. But when we're referring to the axial skeleton, axial meaning referring to your rib cage, your spine, your head, and your neck there, okay? Though it's going to be the exact opposite here. So right here we got dorsal movements there, okay? Dorsal flexion, okay? Flexion is going down in the axial skeleton. So whereas flexion was going up in the appendicular skeleton, flexion means going down in the axial skeleton. Extension would be coming up. Same with the head. or with the neck there. Neck flexion, okay? Head goes down, neck extension, head comes up. Now with your feet there, okay, flexion extension have more specific names, okay? Dorsiflexion means that foot comes up. Plantar flexion, the foot comes down. Okay? I like to think about dorsiflexion, dorsi, looking like a dorsal fin on a shark. So you see this foot right here, it looks like a dorsal fin on a shark. Dorsiflexion, okay, foot comes up. Plantar flexion, I think about plants come from the ground, therefore I'm pushing my foot into the ground. Plantar flexion is that foot pushes down. So all these movements here, again, they're flexion and extension, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. They also all occur in that sagittal plane, which means they all have a transverse axis of rotation. Moving to our frontal plane, okay, meaning that we have an anteroposterior axis of rotation. Okay, any kind of abduction and adduction, okay, those movements occur in our frontal plane, moving about that anteroposterior axis of rotation. So notice the leg kicking out to the side. That's considered abduction. I apologize, that got cut off there. Okay. So abduction, abducted, being abducted by aliens. This comes away from the midline of the body. So here's my midline of my body. Leg is kicking out away. So this would be hip abduction. Bringing the leg in would be considered hip adduction, adding in to the midline of your body. Similar to your shoulder here. Shoulder abduction, shoulder goes away from the midline of the body. Okay. Adduction, shoulder goes towards the midline of your body. With our wrists, we typically have more specific names for wrist movements in our frontal plane. Radial deviation, okay, if we're thinking palms forward, okay, radial deviation meaning going away. It's kind of like wrist abduction. Now the reason it's called radial deviation is your radius, when your palms is forward there, your radius is closer to the outside. So radial deviation from the anatomical position, wrist going away. Ulnar deviation means wrist comes in. It's kind of like wrist adduction. And just like the radius is on the outside, part of the forearm here in this position, your ulna bone is on the inside of your wrist in this position. Likewise, okay, we have special names for ankle movements that occur in that frontal plane. Inversion, okay, means that the bottom of your foot is going to point in, okay, towards the midline. So if your bottom of your foot points in, okay, that's considered inversion. Eversion, okay, it's where this blue foot, that means the bottom of your foot is pointing out. Think eversion, thinking evicted from a house there, okay? So bottom of your foot points out away from the midline of your body. Again, all these movements happen in the frontal plane, moving about that anteroposterior axis of rotation. Looking at torso movements and neck movements, okay? So if I bend my torso side to side there, okay, as well as bending my neck, tipping my head there side to side, okay? These specific names are lateral flexion. So lateral flexion to the right, this would be lateral flexion to the left. Here is neck lateral flexion to the left, and then this way would be neck lateral flexion to the right. Again, lateral flexion occurs in that anterior-posterior axis of rotation, that frontal plane. Now we've got our twisting movements, okay? Remember, all twisting movement occurs in the transverse plane, using that longitudinal axis of rotation there, okay? So external rotation means your foot is going to twist out, okay? Twist away from the body. Internal rotation will be twisting in. So this would be a hip external rotation if that toe pointed out as you twist your hip. Hip internal rotation means toe would point in as you're twisting in. Likewise, same thing happens at the shoulder. External rotation, thumb would turn to point out as your shoulder rotates. And then if your thumb starts to point in, that would be internal rotation. Again, any rotational movement occurs in the transverse plane, rotating around that longitudinal axis of rotation. Now, At the wrist here, okay, we can perform twisting movements, okay? When we perform twisting movements at our wrist there, okay, they have special names for it as well. Pronation and supination, okay? When you twist your thumb out at your wrist there, okay, that would be considered supination, okay? Supination. And I like to think about this as if you held your palm up there to hold a can of soup, okay, that twisting movement to bring your palm up would be considered wrist supination. Versus pronation, okay, pronation, letter P, palm down. If you held my hand, okay, and twisted it so my palm was facing the ground, okay, pronation, letter P, palm down, that would be pronation. Now, on the left side here, this is a special kind of abduction, adduction. This is a bird's eye view of the person. So you got the top of their head there. We're looking at leg movements on the right side and arm or shoulder movements on the left. We've got abduction and adduction, so going away from the midline. Here's my midline, okay? But since this is a top-down view, it's horizontal abduction. So horizontal abduction going away from the midline, horizontal adduction at my shoulder coming in. Likewise with my leg, horizontal abduction going away, horizontal adduction adding in, okay, that be coming in towards the midline. All right, same twisting movements in that transverse plane, the longitudinal axis rotation, can occur there, okay, in the neck and in the torso. Okay, so if I twist my head left and right, shaking my head no, that would be a transverse plane movement going about the longitudinal axis of rotation. Likewise, twisting my torso, same thing. Here's a summary of what we just described on the previous slides there. Okay, so it's important to understand what these different movements are, okay, which plane of movement they occur in, which axis of rotation they rotate about. And I think it would be valuable here for you to know what are a few examples of movements that occur in each of these planes, okay, in each of these axes of rotation. If you have any questions, please let me know. Have a good day. Booyah!